podcast.
True story. I've got some stuff that I'm selling on eBay. And my wife has some stuff that she's selling on eBay. You know, we've got equipment, got some old mics. She's got some photography gear. And we're looking to see how much this stuff is going for on eBay. So I said, come here, let's take a look at it. She gets behind me. I'm on my computer, pull up eBay. And in the search box, as soon as you start typing, it's like Google. It has the list of things that you typed before. You arrow key down, you don't have to type those things in again. And it has things like RE20, Scarlett Focusrite. And the third thing it says is dirty dicks. I said, baby, it's not what you think. Dirty dicks is a hot sauce. And I wasn't able to find any here. So I'm looking on eBay. They didn't have it. I mentioned it because brand names matter. You may be thinking about a rebrand for your podcast. I'm going to talk about that on this podcast, Build a Big Podcast, the marketing podcast for podcasters. If you want to grow your podcast, get more people to your podcast, make a podcast that people care about, make a podcast that earns you money, you are in the right place. I'm David Hooper, bigpodcast.com. That's the website. And this episode, the audio edition of my weekly newsletter, that's called Big Podcast Insider. It goes out every Friday morning, New York City time. Here's what we're talking about. The podcast rebrand. 7 non-negotiable things your podcast needs right now. The 8-step podcast interview plan. The Hawk Tua girl, Haley Welch. She's got a new podcast. It's called Talk Tua. Going to talk about the behind the scenes of that. A one-sheet podcast business blueprint. Royalty-free music for podcasters. Don't bet on it. Also some classified ads, things that will help you to grow your podcast, get more people to your podcast, make a podcast that people care about, the things that this podcast is about. This episode of Build a Big Podcast brought to you by Riverside.fm, a virtual studio that makes recording and editing at the highest quality possible accessible to anyone. You have heard me talk about Riverside Magic Clips. That's their AI tool. It takes your long-form audio. With a single click, it goes through it, chops it up, gets you something that's suitable for social media that's going to drive traffic to your podcast. And you may be wondering, what does that even look like? What does it sound like? Well, I've got an example for you. I'm going to have it linked in the episode notes. Steve Folland, he's a podcaster out of London. He's got a few of these. They're very impressive. They look great. When your listeners see them, they're going to be curious. They're going to say, oh, I wonder what that discussion is about. Oh, I wonder what he's talking about. Then they go to your podcast. It's a great way for you to use social media, for you to use video, and drive traffic to your podcast without getting overwhelmed by YouTube or playing a video game. So if you're interested in taking advantage of videos, if you're interested in taking advantage of social media, Riverside.fm and their AI magic clips, they got you covered. I want you to be able to check it out for yourself. Play around with it. See how it works for you. If you go to Riverside.fm right now, you're going to get a free account up to 2 hours. Do an interview. Do 2 interviews. Check out the AI magic clips. See how it works for you. If you like it, I've got a discount code. It gets you 15% off. That discount code, BIGPODCAST, BIGPODCAST. That's Riverside.fm. Go there right now. Get the free account. Check it out for a couple of hours. If you want to stick around, 15% off with the discount code BIGPODCAST, BIGPODCAST. Let's get to it. All the things that I mentioned at the very beginning of this episode, the things that are in this issue number 197 of Big Podcast Insider, we're going to take them one by one, and in between each one, you're going to hear this sound. That's how you know I've gone on to the next thing. That's how you know. If you want more information, go to newsletter.bigpodcast.com. I got it there. The information, the links, everything that you need. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. The podcast rebrand. There's a Japanese proverb. It says, a man is whatever room he's in right now. That phrase, it suggests that a person's identity or behavior is influenced by their current environment. It implies that we adapt to our surroundings and we change how we act or we present ourselves based on the context that we're in. You might have heard me talk about how if there's a microphone in the room, the conversation changes. And that's a great example of that. People act differently when they know they're being recorded. People act differently when they know something that they're saying could be heard by people outside of that room. It becomes a performance. You hear all this talk about, I'm being transparent and authentic. I call that TNA. Are you? Probably not if there's a microphone in the room. The real transparency, the real authenticity, that's the stuff that's not recorded. But let's talk about what is. Let's talk about your podcast. You happy with your current podcast? That's my question for you. Is it allowing you to be who you want to be? And that's transparent or authentic or not. Are you presenting yourself to the world in the way that you want? If not, change it. This is an episode of Proverbs. There's a Chinese proverb. You've heard this. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. I have decided to make some changes to this podcast. Build a Big Podcast. The artwork has already changed. Go look at the podcast art. If you look at the episode art from this episode, the artwork is different than it was. I've got new episode formats coming. I'm looking at everything. You want to follow along? bigpodcast.com/subscribe. That's how to make sure that you never miss an episode. You've heard me talk about it before. Why haven't you done it? 3 buttons, one for iPhone, one for Android, one is an RSS feed. bigpodcast.com/subscribe. The last episode was the first to use the new artwork, and people have asked me, were you unhappy with the artwork? And it wasn't that I was unhappy with it. You might connect to this. But there were some things that I felt were getting stale. Plus, I'm always trying to improve and make things better for listeners, for you. I'm writing something up right now. Do you know about Big Podcast Extra? It's extra.bigpodcast.com. And when I'm working through all the ideas that I eventually put up in books, Big Podcast Extra, that's the first place that I go. Basically short blog posts, thoughts. You can get it via email if you want. All those things designed to grow your podcast, get more people to your podcast. The same thing this podcast is about. Extra.bigpodcast.com. I'm going to be talking more about the rebrand of this podcast. This podcast has actually changed names once. It was called Big Podcast Daily when it started. I never thought that I was going to do it more than 30 days. It was a 30-day project. 30 days, 30 episodes in a row, done. Well, I kept going. But I didn't want to do it daily. So after about 150-something days, started calling it Build a Big Podcast. Do I like the name? I'll talk more about this on Big Podcast Extra. But no, I don't really like the name. The issue that I've got with a name like Big Podcast, which is what I could call it, same as Big Podcast Daily. Big Podcast Daily, it was a podcast on podcasting, but people thought it was a news podcast. I mean, big is general, podcast is general. They say never use the name podcast in the title of your podcast. Well, what do you do if the podcast is about podcasting? Then you're in trouble. I could have called it Big Podcast, that on its own, but that's kind of the same thing. Sounds like a general podcast, pop culture, influencer stuff, whatever. Build a Big Podcast. Not sexy, but what do you want? You want to build a big podcast. So here you are, the marketing podcast for podcasters. Anyway, I'm going to have more information at Big Podcast Extra. That's extra.bigpodcast.com. I will have more information here in the written issue and also the next audio edition of Big Podcast Insider. You can find more information on that, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Let's talk about Big Podcast AMP. If you like this podcast, if you like the newsletter, you're going to love Big Podcast AMP. That stands for Audio Monetization Program. It's a personal coaching program. It's going to help you do 3 things. 1, grow your podcast audience. 2, get people talking about your podcast. The third thing, make more money with your podcast and also your podcasting skills. You're good at talking. And you might think, nah, not really. Yeah, you're better than most people. And because of that, there are people who are not as good as you that want that skill that you have and are willing to pay for it. You want to know how to make money with it? I'm going to show you Big Podcast AMP. You can get the details at bigpodcast.com/AMP, bigpodcast.com/AMP. 7 non-negotiable things your podcast needs right now. I'm going to respond to an article. It's about newsletters. Everything here applies to your podcast. There's a ton of noise in the world. You know that. And because of that, it is getting harder to get the attention of people. How a lot of podcasters combat this, and also online content creators, they actually may be doing it even more than podcasters do. It's what I call the content treadmill. They do more episodes, more videos, more social media posts. I knew a guy, pretty well-known Instagrammer, got set up with a big agency, and he was really excited about it. The first thing they did, you need to be posting more. So this guy who was already burnt out doing something daily, maybe a couple times a day, they wanted him posting 4 times a day. Of course that's going to get your numbers up because you're putting out twice as many, maybe 4 times as many videos. Yeah, it's going to get your numbers up. Is the experience going to be as satisfying for you or the people who are watching you? Probably not. Frankly, he's a one-trick pony. Have you seen these guys on Instagram? I'm in Gen X. And because of that, I get a lot of Gen X content. Instagram knows how old I am. They're sending me this Gen X content. And they're about 4 or 5 people. All they do is tell jokes about Gen X. And it's not even jokes, it's a joke. Essentially the same joke every day about how we were neglected. We drank hose water. We listened to Journey, whatever. It's different variations of the same joke. And that's what this guy that I know did. And the agency's like, yeah, we need more of that. More of that same joke. Anyway, let's get to the much better option for you. These are 7 things that you can do to get your podcast more attention and make the most of the listeners that you have. The first thing that you need a clear niche. It needs to be obvious who your podcast is for. I talked about this podcast and the rebrand. The reason this podcast is called Build a Big Podcast is because that immediately attracts people who want to build a big podcast. Not just big podcast, not just big podcast daily. That's too general. Look at your podcast title, what your content is. 1, do you have a clear niche? Do you have specific content that you're releasing? And is it obvious in your title, in your episodes, the other stuff that you're putting out? A clear point of view within that niche. That's number 2. This is the distinct perspective from which you convey your message. You listen to me, and I'm going to assume that you have. You've heard me talk about my background in the music industry. I've got a background in radio. 20 years, I've had a syndicated show. I've got a very specific point of view to some guys that just do podcasting or just do online content. I talked about being in Gen X, 51 years old. I've got a very specific view because of that than somebody who's in his 20s or 30s. A non-neutral voice, that's number 3. It needs to be obvious where you stand on related issues. You need to edit your podcast. There's no, well, if it's convenient, edit your podcast. No, edit your podcast. Come correct, man. If you're going to speak into a good mic. If you're going to interview somebody, respect their message by editing them and making them sound good. And respect your own message by editing yourself and getting that message out to the audience. If you save 1 minute off your podcast, and me, I save, usually about 40% probably. Right now, it's 18 minutes and 23 seconds. That's where I am. Big Podcast Supercomputer, give me the time.
This is the Big Podcast Supercomputer with a courtesy time check. You are now 12 minutes and 54 seconds into this episode. Approximately 6 minutes of tape, roughly 1/3 of what was recorded, has been removed.
That's how much editing has gone on so far. Are you doing the same thing? Let me get back to my point. If you even save 1 minute off your episode, and you've got 500 listeners, you have saved the world 500 minutes of wasted time. Your listeners deserve that. Number 4, mostly insights, some promotion. People want the meat, and that includes entertainment podcasts. Don't give people just ads. You've heard a couple of ads on here so far. One for Riverside. Riverside pays me money. I try to make those ads as entertaining as possible. You, because you are a podcaster trying to build a big podcast, Riverside is going to help you. The ad reads are live. They are different every time. I never hit play and give you a recording of the same thing. This episode's ad, I'm giving you the name of another podcaster, letting you know how he's using Riverside, how he's using these social media clips, giving you a link if you want to look at the episode notes so you can view what I'm talking about. That's going to help you. So it's an ad, but it's also something that's valuable to you. That's number 4, mostly insights, some promotion. Number 5, this is her words, not mine. A pillow over the face of anything with a whiff of, dear valued listener. You sound like Judith Martin, Miss Manners. Gentle reader, I don't talk to you like gentle listener. Hey, out there in podcast land. I say you, because I'm talking to a single person. That person is you. Are there a lot of you? Yeah. You and the next guy and the next guy and the next guy and the next guy. But we're not talking about him or her. We're talking about you. And you are not a nameless, faceless group of people. You are not even a podcaster. And you certainly don't live in podcasting land. No. Consider that when you're talking to people. You. One person. Not a city. Hey, Nashville. These rock stars. He's in these concerts. Hello, Cleveland. That's great when there's a class consciousness. When you got one group all watching the same thing. And you could say, well, you got a big group all listening to the same podcast. Yeah. But your listeners are doing it individually. Maybe you got somebody who's in a car. There's somebody else around listening to it with that person. Don't assume it. Most podcasts listen to via headphones. Most podcasts listen to alone. Not the nameless, faceless group. Not even a named group. Number 6, same thing. She says lots of yous. Do that. Lots of yous. Again, you're talking to a single person. So if you can throw that in your podcast, do it. Number 7, relax, have fun, loosen up, and open your heart. Listeners want to connect with hosts who are real. Be that person. I told a story at the very beginning of this episode about dirty dicks. I keep this podcast clean. You never hear me say words like f*** or shit or mother. It's a clean podcast. Not necessarily family-oriented, but I understand, as you probably understand, if you use words like shit or f*** or mother, you're going to instantly turn people off. Related to that, letting people in on your life, letting them know about the funny things that happen to you. I don't necessarily talk about my personal life. If I had kids, I would never mention them. I don't talk about the inner workings of my marriage, nothing like that. But I will say something funny, actually, because a lot of people know my wife. She and I used to co-host a podcast together called Red. So a lot of people from Red moved over to here when that podcast ended. So a lot of people know my wife. It's a fine balance. You want to show that you're human, that you're a real person. There's more to you than just what you talk about on your podcast. I think the best way to do that is finding a balance. Let people in. As she says, open your heart, loosen up. But keep it about business. Like she said earlier, a non-neutral voice, mostly insights, some promotion, and also some personality. It's not all about you. There's that word again. It's about your listeners. You listeners, not you, the host. If you need help, I've talked about Big Podcast AMP, the audio monetization program. More information, bigpodcast.com/AMP. If you want to work together, let's do that. Let's make it happen. You want the written list? 7 non-negotiable things your podcast needs right now? Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. This is issue number 197. The 8-step podcast interview plan. It sucks to go into the studio with somebody you're excited about interviewing only to walk away without the great episode that you imagined. If you do enough interviews, this is going to happen to you. It does not matter how much you prepare. Sometimes you're off. Sometimes your guest is off. Sometimes the equipment fails. It does not matter how much you prepared, how skillful your guest is at media, how skilled you are at interviewing. This happens to everybody, even the best host, even the best guests. But you can make it happen a lot less if you follow this plan. 8 steps. Number 1, do your research. Don't just show up. 2, create a flexible outline. You want to see my outline? I've got it linked to newsletter.bigpodcast.com. This is issue number 197. Number 3, use open-ended questions that encourage storytelling. I've got examples of that too. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com, issue number 197. In fact, if I ask a question, if I've got it written down on my plan, I will handwrite story. Tell a story. Ask for a story. I will tell this to guests before we start rolling tape. If you look at any of my episode notes, and I'm talking about the real episode notes, the ones that I put together to interview someone, I probably write story down 5 or 6 times. Story, 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 story. Facts tell, stories sell. And I'm not saying that you're selling anything, but you are. Not in a product way, but you are selling your podcast. You are selling people on, hey, let me give this guy a little bit more time to listen to him. Open-ended questions that encourage storytelling. That's number 3. Number 4, listen actively. That sounds obvious, doesn't it? Like, no shit. But few podcasters do it. You heard the death dedication? Casey Kasem? This is a Gen X thing. If you're under 30, look him up. Casey Kasem knew about pacing. I'm going to play this clip for you. The music is not included. If you're curious, it was Dare Me by the Pointer Sisters. As Casey says, an upbeat number. Most people, if you're into any kind of pop music, especially EDM, you will have heard this song because it gets sampled all the time. Anyway, it's upbeat. Casey's going into a death dedication. It's a train wreck. It's like, hey, dare me. Death dedication for a little dog named Snuggles. Doesn't work. Music sets the tone. Your interview is the same way. Let me play this and I'll get back with my point.
Now, we're up to our long-distance dedication. And this one is about kids and pets and a situation that we can all understand, whether we have kids or pets or neither. It's from a man in Cincinnati, Ohio. And here's what he writes. Dear Casey, this may seem to be a strange dedication request, but I'm quite sincere, and it'll mean a lot if you play it. Recently, there was a death in our family. He was a little dog named Snuggles, but he was most certainly a part of... Let's start again. From coming out of the record. Play the record, okay? Please. See, when you come out of those up-tempo goddamn numbers, man, it's impossible to make those transitions, and then you got to go into somebody dying. You know, they do this to me all the time. I don't know what the hell they do it for, but if we can't come out of a slow record, I don't understand it. Is Don on the phone? Okay, I want a concerted effort to come out of a record that isn't a fucking up-tempo record every time I do a death dedication. This is last goddamn time I want somebody to use his fucking brain to not come out of a goddamn record that is that's up-tempo, and I got to talk about a fucking dog dying. Boy, this is ponderous, man. Ponderous, fucking ponderous.
If you're doing an interview, you've got to guess who's saying something. And there needs to be a transition into what is said next. If your guest says something, you need to follow up on it. Don't just go into a death dedication. And that would be, tell me about a success quote. I've seen that happen. Newer podcasters, guys who just don't care, don't have the awareness. They plan every question out. I've got to get through this list. They don't care what the guest is saying. Question 2, question 3, question 4, question 5. It doesn't matter if it's a train wreck. Nobody's listening to question 3, 4, 5, and 6 because it's like, no. This guy doesn't even know what he's doing. He ignored the guest. So listen actively and look for those moments. If you are thinking it, your audience is thinking it. Number 5, maintain a conversational tone. Talk with people, not at them. It's you talking on the mic for your podcast, but it's a conversation with your listener. They are in it with you. You, listening to me, are thinking in your head, yeah, I've got this podcast. Yeah, I've had moments like that. We're having an interaction even though it's just me talking. And by the way, if you ever want to reach out to me, I've got all my social media links, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Feel free. I love to have interactions online like that. And also, if you bring something up I need to respond to via this podcast, yeah, let's make it happen. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. All the social media links to reach out to me, they are there. Number 6, be adaptable. This goes back to what I was saying earlier. If you're thinking, I should ask an additional question about that, the audience is also. Mike Tyson has that famous quote, everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the face. That's how your interviews are. You can go into an interview, all the plan in the world. But as soon as you ask that first question, that plan is done. You might be able to get back to it some ways, but it's not going to be that linear approach unless you go question 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, not listening to the response and just ramrod that thing. And that's not a conversation. That's not really an interaction. There's no interaction there. That's you hearing yourself talk, asking random stuff. What's your favorite success quote? Nobody connects to that. It's all over the place. Linear message. People want that beginning, the middle, and an end. Number 7, monitor the clock to ensure you cover important topics within the time you have available. If I've got, let's say, an hour with somebody, on the broadcast show, I interview musicians a lot. I know that musician, at least his publicist, wants to talk about the new record. Not necessarily what that musician has done in the past, but it's what that musician has done in the past, the old stuff, the big hits. That's what listeners want to hear. So I've got to get all of that in. I want to keep listeners happy, That's the first thing on my list, because the listeners, those are the guys that I'm with. The guy that I'm interviewing, yeah, I want to keep him happy too. That's why I'm talking about the new stuff. But that guy's out of there. He's not the listeners. He's not the person who's put me where I am. So I've got to watch that clock, knowing that, yeah, I got to get to the new stuff. And if I've only got an hour, and I probably, maybe 60, 70% in, start transitioning into the new stuff. Let's make everybody happy. So think about that. Watch the clock. Make sure you cover important topics. Get the tape that you want, but also just to be courteous. And I'm not saying give away your time. And I'm not saying give away your platform. It's got to be good content. It's got to be content that works for you. But if you've got somebody who's promoting something new, like a musician, an author, an actor, talk about what they're promoting. That's the courteous thing. That's the trade-off. But also talk about what your audience wants. Number 8, after the interview, review the recording and also your notes to see what worked well and what could be improved. This is one of the reasons that I tell people to edit themselves. The podcasters who never edit their podcasts, that is not being courteous to your audience. That is wasting their time. You are not that good. If you hire out your editing, that's a courtesy to your audience, but you are missing important lessons that you learn from editing yourself. You learn a lot about your speech patterns, about what's important, about how to improve as a host when you edit yourself. I'm not saying you have to do it forever. I'm not saying you have to do it all the time. But you would be smart to listen to your raw tape and think, okay, this needs to go, this needs to go. This is going to make this podcast better. That's going to make you a better host. So do review your tape. Watch a sports documentary or know somebody who's been in sports, they're looking at game tape. That's you. And you're actually in the business of taping yourself, so you should have a lot of it. That's the 8-step podcast interview plan. If you want it in writing, I have it, and also more information on it. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. This is issue number 197. The Hot Tua girl, Haley Welch, she's got a new podcast, Talk Tua. She signed a deal with Jake Paul's media company. $100,000 for the first season. That's the number. It's connected to Better, B-E-T-R is how you spell that. That's a mobile betting company, and she is also doing social media content. I'm interested to see how this turns out. There's a promo video. It seems like what I would call YouTuber content, kind of basic. Pop culture, sex. I mean, yeah. Not anything somebody over 25, maybe even 20 would be interested in. Obviously, there's an audience. Jake Paul knows how to build an audience of that kind of stuff. He knows what he's doing. He's got his audience. He's giving them more of what they want. It's not what I would do for a long-term career. However, there are no guarantees of a long-term career. She got famous for one saying, Hawk Tua. She has trademarked that. She has made about $1 million so far. And this thing's only been going on for a couple months. So she is cashing in. She's done a lot of good with the money, by the way. She started an animal charity. She's trying to get more people to adopt dogs. She put $500,000 of her own money into this. And that's why I'm a little bit frustrated about this. There is depth to this woman. She's actually pretty good on the mic. She's more than a single catchphrase. But, kind of going into that basic YouTuber catchphrase type content. She's done well so far working with the hand that she's been dealt. I'm excited to see what she's doing with it. She's had a lot of great publicity because of her animal charity work. Like I said, a little bit more depth than meets the eye. I think she is worth watching. If you want to see that promo video, if you want to find out more information about her, I've got it linked. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. This is issue number 197. A one-sheet podcast business blueprint. This is called Solo Business Canvas. As I mentioned, it is a one-page, I'm calling it a blueprint. It allows you to see what your entire podcasting business is on a single page, or any business. You can get it free. It's going to help you get clear on what you offer. You'll spot new ways to make money, as I call it, money on the table. Identify your ideal listener. Map the resources you need. You're going to know your exact next steps. So if you're wondering, I don't know what to do next, things feel a little stalled in my podcast, you're going to find the one-sheet podcast business blueprint She calls it the solo business canvas helpful. I've seen more and more people embrace hobby podcasting lately, and I love that. Even if you are a hobby podcaster, you're not thinking of this as a business, I encourage you to look at this. Think about what you are doing, because what you are doing is reaching people. It is helping people. Even if it's an entertainment-related thing. Talked about Haley Welch. Basic YouTube content, but there's that subtext of adopt, don't shop. You got something like that yourself. Solo Business Canvas may help you to uncover it. If you want it, I've got it linked, newsletter.bigpodcast.com, issue number 197. Persona Music. This is royalty-free music for podcasters. The right soundtrack will bring your content to life. I talked about the ads that I've got on this podcast. One of them, Riverside.fm. They've been a longtime sponsor. Every ad, music behind it. A different song every time. Music for your podcast is more affordable than ever. And good music for your podcast is more affordable than ever. Persona Music, I've got a link that's going to get you 10,000 songs that you can use for only $29. Under $30, 10,000 songs. You're going to find something that you like. If you want to listen to some of them, I got them linked. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. This is issue number 197. Don't bet on it. We got Haley Welch on this, promoting better. The bet is, can you do a good interview without doing a pre-interview? And the answer is, don't bet on it. I'm working on an NPR piece right now. There are 4 guests. The episode is live, meaning that the host talks into a mic and it goes out everywhere. If there's a mistake, it goes out everywhere. Dead air? Well, I guess that doesn't go out everywhere, but nothing's going out. You don't want that either. People say, oh, I don't need a pre-interview. Yeah, you do. You're not that good. I got a funny joke about it. It's at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. This is issue number 197. Doing a pre-interview with a guest will significantly enhance the quality of your podcast episodes. Even a quick conversation. I'm talking 10, 15 minutes. That's going to help you gauge a guest's communication style, comfort level, knowledge on the topic. I had a pre-interview today, an hour. It was actually quite fun. She was amazing. I could tell instantly that I had made the right choice in approaching this guest. So we got to get you on your own show. That kind of thing. And when you find something like that, it makes it all worth it. It makes me more confident going into this interview. I hear her say things because we are not being taped that she might not bring up when we are taping or when we are broadcasting. And I can bring those things up because it's not that she doesn't want to talk about them. Maybe it's that she's more comfortable during the pre-interview. So think about that. Pre-interviews, man, that's right up there with editing. I got a funny joke about it. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. This is issue number 197. Classified ads for you. These are things that will help you to grow your podcast, get more people to your podcast, make a podcast that people care about, make a podcast that makes you money. You need a website. And the easiest way for you to do that for your podcast is Podpage. 25,000 podcasters have done it. You can automatically create a beautiful listen-friendly website from your RSS feed. That's it. Plug the RSS feed in. Done. Podpage is going to hook you up. Now, you're going to want to edit it. It might take you 10, 15 minutes, but seriously, no more than that to get a basic web page up for your podcast. That's where to send people. Don't tell them, wherever you get your podcast. People say, what? I don't know. I heard a podcast, but I don't know how I got it. Tell them to go to blank.com, like bigpodcast.com, or newsletter.bigpodcast.com. And if you go there right now, you can try Podpage for free. This is issue number 197, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Audio pen. I love this. This is the easiest way to convert messy thoughts into clear text, including podcast outlines. The pre-interview that I mentioned, 1 hour long. I could have recorded it, and if I'd plugged it into Audio Pen and said, Audio Pen, give me the highlights. Give me the stories. Boom, 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 boom. It's going to give me an outline. I can go back, highlight the things that I wanted to discuss on the real episode from the printout that it gives. It is very cool. You hear a lot of talk about AI these days. You can use it to make a better podcast. Audio Pen is one of the tools that will allow you to do that. You can try it for free. It's at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Hey, thanks for joining me on this episode of Build a Big Podcast. If you have not subscribed, bigpodcast.com/subscribe. That is the easiest way to do it. One click is all it takes. One click for iPhone, one click for Android, one click for an RSS feed. And if you're serious about podcasting and you want to make more money with your podcast, attract a bigger audience, make a podcast that people care about, the best way for me to work with you personally is called Big Podcast AMP. That stands for Audio Monetization Program. And that URL, bigpodcast.com/AMP, bigpodcast.com/AMP. Go there, read the letter. It's long, but it's important because I want you to know what you're getting into. There's a lot of work to be done. And if you're looking for somebody to work through it with you, I'm that guy. bigpodcast.com/AMP. Check it out. Get subscribed, and I'll see you on the next episode of Build a Big Podcast.